Hi, welcome back to Celebrating Culture. We're here today at the Brick Oven Cafe in Kenner, Louisiana, and I'm with Michela Musolino. Michela is a Sicilian songstress, and you've traveled the world, really, Italy, America, all over the place. We met as one of your tours, and so it's great to meet you, and you are really, your knowledge of Sicilian music history is just overwhelming to me, so I'm so grateful you're on the show.
Thanks
Welcome.
for having me. Thanks. You know, anytime I get a chance to talk about Sicilian music, I'm there. I'm very happy to do it.
So Michela, as I've been studying this, I think you're saying we could go back to about 470 BC.
Yes. There is what we call, we would say the filo conduttore, or the continuing line that shows that Sicily always had a unique body of music. So the first song that was documented in Sicily, we would call it, it was the first Pythian ode. And it was written by Pindar in 470 BC. It was written in honor of Hiero, who is the tyrant, or Hiron, the tyrant of Syracuse. And it was a victory ode. It was a composition that was meant to be sung and danced in honor of the victories that they had over invaders coming into Sicily.
Sicily, when you tour it in Agrigento, the temples there go back to this era.
The temples, if you notice, are typically built with the backdrop of the stage being the sea. And we look at that and we say, well, they love to have beauty. The ancient people love beauty, but there was a darker reason for that. They were always worried about invasions. So even in their moments of recreation, they had to still think about protecting themselves, and they had to still be vigilant. So that's why they would put their theaters so that they could always see and watch the coast to make sure that they weren't being invaded. They could never let down their guards and just enjoy something.
When you're in the Taormina Theater, it's a beautiful ancient theater, you're looking at the ocean.
It's the backdrop of the stage, so they could see the ships if they were invading at that moment.
So music evolves.
Well, if we go back to about 350 BC, we'll go forward into about 350 BC, we have a historian by the name of Timaeus, and he was from Taormina, and he recorded a lot of history of the ancient world, of ancient Sicily and ancient Greece. And he talked to us about itinerant celebrations that would take place throughout the night. They would involve music and dancing. So this idea, and they sprang out of religious rituals, which pretty much all our traditions of music came from originally religious rituals. So we can start seeing a pattern with this idea of the music and the itinerant musicians and celebrations and the secular music growing out of religious rituals. And then if we jump forward a little bit and we get into what we would consider modern times, we're not an ancient world anymore, we could look at the court of King Frederick II, Re Federico II, and he was also called the Stupor Mondi because of the great wonders. He was the wonder of the world because of the way he led the world in art and literature. So his court was a center for literature, and it's believed that the sonnet was born in his court. And it's something that was called the Ottava Siciliana. So it's 11 syllables, the hendecasyllabic, which is very indicative of a sonnet. And it's 8 lines that rhyme A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. And that we know is the first 8 lines of a sonnet. And why is that so important? Because most of Sicilian folk music and traditional music is in that form, that structure, that meter and the structure of the 8 lines and the rhyming.
Also during this period here, we get into the 12th and 13th century. You were talking about like barbers and the songs for the fishing. Tell us some of that background.
In Sicily, barber shops were a social center too. It wasn't just a place for men to get their haircut. It was a place for men to congregate, and there was music. And typically barbers were musicians. Why is this important? Well, it was first identified, it's a very old tradition in Sicily, and the first time it was documented was in 1491. It's a document from Messina, and it talks about a barber. His name was Gregorio de Berto, and he tells the story that he had a student, and he was teaching his student vocal compositions and with musical accompaniment. And this is seminal for the work that we do because it shows us so many things. It shows us, first of all, it's the first time that the barber was referred to not only as a profession, but as a profession that was involved with music. It was identified barber and music. And it also identified the fact that this student was being taught from the body of Sicilian songs. So in 1491, already the world was identifying Sicily as having its own kind of music, as having a repertoire that was particular to Sicily.
Also, we see in New Orleans, we had the funeral marches.
There was a historian, his name was the Marchese of Villabianca. In the mid-1700s, he was already identifying this tradition of having musicians and singers at funerals in Sicily, and he already identified it as a well-established tradition. One of the things that was interesting is that in around 1661, the Jesuits in Palermo started a tradition of what we call the orbi, and orbi means blind or blind men. And in that culture, it was an agrarian culture, so it was felt that these young boys would be at a disadvantage. How could they survive? How could they have a family if they were blind? So the Jesuits trained them musically. And the idea was they would be hired to make music for the sacred events. Among the events that they would make this music for would also be, they would play the novenas and they would play them at the funerals. And that was in 1661 that this started, or it was identified as starting around 1661. And typically they were sent out in 2 by 2. And that also eventually changed. It grew, eventually they would add more musicians, and eventually these itinerant musicians would also not necessarily all be blind. It started out as something that would help the blind men, and that continued really into the 20th century. But eventually these itinerant musicians became just men that could also see.
So that evolved into the second line.
So it has ancient roots, it goes back to the 1400s and the 1600s.
Fishing. The fishermen would sing songs to be able to know how to pull the nets together.
Yeah, there is a tradition in Sicily, it was called the matanza, and it was the hunt of the tuna. At one time, the waters of the Mediterranean were loaded with tuna, and the tuna had a seasonal migrational pattern. So there was an annual hunt that would take place, and according to these seasonal patterns. And it was a ritual. And it was a ritual that was also executed with song. And because you had scores of men working together to pull these nets up. So they would work rhythmically, they would have to carry on this rhythm in unison. So they would sing songs. And a song that arose, or a style of singing, was called the Chayaloma. And these were chants that the men would sing together in unison, and that's how they could work together. They had specific songs they sang when they raised the boats out of the water, when they had to put the boats in dry dock, because they had to do that all manually. So they would work and they would sing these songs together.
Sicily becomes a fishing place. They're also dealing with pirates.
Yes. Sicily, because it's a strategic location in the Mediterranean, it's centrally located, it's always been abundant with resources. So it was a great destination for pirates since antiquity.
New Orleans has a large Ustican population. And I understand that in 1762, a whole city of Ustica was taken one night.
In fact, they were moved there from the island of Lipari. I believe they were moved there to protect them, but they were kidnapped anyway. And they were held ransom for a number of years.
You had a relative.
Yes.
That was actually part of this.
My grandfather came from a town called Borgetto in the Provincia di Palermo, and he came from a family of merchants. It was a situation where the merchant was going on a voyage, and his son was an adolescent, and he thought it'd be wonderful to start the son on this life and acquaint him with the sea, so he took his son with him. But their ships were captured, and he and his son were held for ransom, and the ransom note was sent to his wife, and she was given a choice. You could have your husband, or you could have your son, but you can't have both. So she made the choice to have her son returned to her, because she felt, well, my husband's an adult, he can handle himself, and my son is young, he needs to have his life ahead of him. But the story is that he came back and he was never right. We would consider it to like what they call the post-traumatic stress disorder, because I can't imagine how anyone in Sicily survived that, but that's our family story.
I was reading some stuff from the U.S. War Department about the war, and they talk about a man in Catania running into town demanding the governor do something because his wife and son were kidnapped.
In the song that I sing, that I was telling you about, there's one part of the song where saying, you can hear the voices of the sailors at night crying out because they're being led away in chains. And that was really what happened. They would come to the coast at night and just sneak away with the sons. That was a way of showing dominance. They would sneak away with whoever they could grab and spirit away at night.
So by 1804, Sicily's already at war with Libya and Tunisia. We call it the Barbary Coast, but those are the four countries: Algiers, Morocco. Those four countries are the Barbary Coast.
Tunisia and Libya, yeah.
And then the United States gets involved because the United States has sailors starting to be captured when they're in the Mediterranean.
Yep.
So Thomas Jefferson gets into this war.
Yeah, well, we asked the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies to help us militarily. So at that time, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies had the third largest navy in the world. Before the unification of Italy, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies was a strong naval power. So we asked them for military support, and they let us use their ports. They let us use Palermo and Siracusa. The story where we're going, we're going to wind up in Catania, because Catania was used as a port for recreation. So they would have dances, they would have concerts, they would have different performances all around music. So when Thomas Jefferson wanted to establish the Marine Band, he really believed that the musicians from Italy were more refined. It was better music. He had an Italian violin teacher, and violin teacher taught his whole family. He'd spent some time actually in northern Italy years prior, and he was acquainted with Italian style music. So when Thomas Jefferson was looking for musicians, he sent John Hall to Catania, and he found this band. It was the Carusi band, and he paid the musicians and their families, their wives, to come to the US to be part of the Marine Band. But they had to be enlisted. So these were not just musicians, they were actually enlisted as soldiers. It was a little bit of a surprise for them because they saw some action before they got to the US. Once they got to Washington, D.C. in 1805, Washington wasn't the city that we know it today. It was pretty much just a military encampment. So it was a little delusional. But from that original group of Sicilians from Catania, one of those musicians was a 12-year-old boy. He'd come with his father, and the young man's name was Venerando Pulizzi, and he stayed in the band for 22 years, and he eventually rose up to the ranks of the Marine Band, the director of the Marine Band. And then after he was director of the Marine Band, he stayed in the Marines for more years. But that triggered this Italian invasion of musicians, because eventually we would have four, right in succession, we'd have about 4 directors of the Marine Band, including Venerando Pulizzi.
We actually were able to interview the director of the Marine Band here in
awesome.
New Orleans. And he tells that story, and it's amazing because, like you said, he finishes being in the band, and he stays in the Marines for another 2 decades.
2 decades.
He's got 47 years in the Marines.
Can you imagine?
Which has got to be the record. A little bit more background is that's when the Marine hymn, From the Halls of Montezuma to the Shores of Tripoli, comes in, and the Sailing with Decatur, and most people can connect because there's a Decatur, Illinois, Decatur, Georgia, we have Decatur Street in New Orleans. We have Salvador Catalano, who actually piloted Decatur's boat. So when people know what era we're talking about, if you see anything named Decatur, this is when Thomas Jefferson brings those Sicilians back to be in the band.
Having the Sicilians here, as I said, it kind of triggered an invasion, because it got to be in the United States that if you had an Italian as your band director, any band, if it was your town band, your opera house band, it was considered that you had a good band. It was a kind of a status symbol to have an Italian director for your band.
Then we see the opera halls being built in America during this period, and New Orleans had its famous opera halls as well, some of the largest. And in Italy, we still see the halls there are just phenomenal. So a professor in Pisa has done a lot of studying about this Marine Band situation.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about him.
Professor Martinelli, and he tells the story from start to finish about how there was this band in Catania, the Carusi Brothers Band. He expands on that idea that because there was the tradition in Sicily to have these bands for any kind of event. So they played religious music, they played dance hall music, they played for the Teatro dei Pupi, the marionette shows. Any kind of event would have music because there was no recorded music yet. So that's how, when Captain Hall came to Catania, that's how he was able to see the Carusi band, because they were constantly playing. That was the tradition, to have music at all kinds of events in Sicily.
And today, Sicilian jazz festivals are big.
Yeah, jazz is big in Sicily.
It is.
Yeah.
So I look at, we have this, to me, the debate is that did the Sicilians bring jazz to New Orleans, or did New Orleans send jazz to Sicily? Because we had in 1870 all these Sicilians coming over. So we know the Sicilians were playing something prior to 1870.
I don't know how you'd ever take them out of the history of jazz, and I don't know how you could ever negate their influence, And you really, the beautiful thing about New Orleans at that time, you had this crash of cultures coming together. So I'm sure there was a blend, contributions from everybody. And, it's not really far-fetched to think that other cultures were going through the same thing at the same time that was happening in Sicily. People sang in the fields in every culture. Barbershops are social centers. People sing at funerals. We come from similar backgrounds. Yes. We may express it differently, and then when we get together, then we create something else. And I think that's kind of what happened with the Sicilian jazz. But we had so many great early jazz players that were Sicilian, right? And of course, the great Nick LaRocca.
Today, jazz has a very strong presence in Italy and in Sicily.
Yes.
And it seems like it didn't just come from the United States, that it was in the heart of the people there. It evolved as part of this 2,500 year progression.
Yeah.
You're going back to 400 BC. Yeah. We're 2,500 years now of Sicilian music. Tell me a little bit about the instruments.
Well, Sicily started out, as you see, we have these beautiful drums. We can start out with the ancient instruments, and this is probably the oldest instrument that was used. And it was typically in the realm of the women, the drum, the frame drum, and they would look just like this: a wooden circle with a goat skin on it, and then metal jingles. And again, this started out with the religious rituals. It started out with like the rites of Dionysus, or the Bacchante, or for Bacchus or Dionysus. And from these religious rituals, where the women were considered like priestesses, they would guide the ritual, and they would guide it with rhythms of the drum. From this came secular music eventually. It wasn't just for religious rituals. But the drum stayed in the realm of women into modern times. It was only really in the latter part of the 20th century that men started drumming, and now we have all these great young guys that are like virtuosi on the drums. But primarily it was something that women did. It was considered a woman's instrument. And in Sicily, the first thing that a young bride would put in her house would be a drum, because every house has spirits in it, the mire, and you want to keep them happy. So a drum brings happiness into your house, and it keeps the house spirits happy.
Other instruments, because I said here we've got a couple of reed instruments.
Yeah, this is the friscaletto, which is a Sicilian cane flute, and this probably hasn't changed much since antiquity. Literally made out of one piece of cane. There are stories and songs in Sicily called l'ossa che canta, the bones that sing, because some of these, before they made it out of cane, it used to be made out of bird bones. And the sound of this flute sounds just like a bird. The story of the ossa che canta, it's typically a king has two children, usually an older and a younger, sometimes it's the male and the female. He promises whoever can find this feather from the magical bird gets half his kingdom. The young one finds it, the old one is jealous, kills the young one, but claims the victory and disposes of the body in a swamp. The shepherd finds either a bone, or the shepherd finds a cane and makes a flute out of it. He makes a flute out of something. And when he plays the flute, the spirit of that child comes back and tells him the truth, and he goes to the king so there can be justice made. But that's a very old story.
When I was in Sicily, you'll see bands, like normally about a 5-piece band, really dressed very nicely with an accordion and a friscaletta, and they go through the marketplace, so to speak, in the evenings, playing music for the restaurants.
Yep, it's that old tradition, the itinerant music going from house to house. There's a tradition that takes place in modern times in Sicily, but it goes back to antiquity. It's called the strina. And the strina comes from the Roman goddess Strenia or Strenuia. And it was a festival that was celebrated the darkest time of the year. So it was around the 6th, we would consider today like around the 6th or the 8th of December. So either the Feast of St. Nicholas to the Immaculate Conception, all the way through to January 6th, which is Epiphany. And it was a time when they would give gifts. And it's believed that this is what happens. This is where we get the idea for strina, these itinerant musicians that go from house to house, because that's what they did during those rituals. It's also believed that strenia was the original befana, that befana evolved from that. But the strina in modern times, it's a ritual where the musicians go from house to house and they call down blessings and sing songs to the people inside. And if you want to receive those blessings, you open up your house and you welcome the musicians in and you wine them and dine them, give them wine and something to eat. And then when they're happy, you send them on their way, and they go to the next house, and they make the blessings for the next house.
Michela, you live in Memphis now.
Yes, I do.
Is there any connection between the blues and Sicilian music?
Sure is. There are some scholars, musical scholars, that think that the tarantella is just really evolved into the blues shuffle. We know that the first blues published here in the U.S. was published by a Sicilian, Antonio Maggio. And when he came from Sicily, his background is he was a barber that made music, as did his father and all his brothers. And they constantly were going back and forth between this musician-barber.
Michela, you're performing across the country now, California, Florida, the Carolinas. If someone wants to reach you to perform at their event or get your music, how do they do that?
They would go to my website, michelamusolino.com, and you can actually write to me through my website. You can find my schedule there, my show schedule. You can purchase my albums there. You can purchase them in physical form. You can purchase downloads.
Michela, I want to thank you for being on the
Thank
show.
you for having me.
And it's great seeing you again. And I want to thank everyone at Brick Oven Cafe for letting us use their facility here. Great pizzas, great pastas. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more of Celebrating Culture.